They thought I was fragile, they thought I would obey, they thought I would disappear quietly into the shadows of their lies. But they were wrong, they had no idea what they were unleashing. I still remember the first time my son Michael betrayed me. I had raised him with every ounce of my strength, every sleepless night, every sacrifice that left my own life hollow. I had believed that family was sacred, that love was a shield against cruelty, but I was wrong. Michael, the boy who once clung to me at night, had changed. He had married a woman, Vanessa, who seemed kind at first, but I soon learned that kindness was a mask. It started with small things, subtle, cruel little gestures that whispered of disdain, a dismissive look at the dinner table, a comment about how I never understood the modern way of life. Then, the warnings became sharper. The first real betrayal came on a Wednesday evening. Michael called me, his voice oddly casual. "Mom," he said, "I think it's time you moved into that assisted living home we talked about." I hesitated. "Why, I'm fine, I can manage." "No, Mom, it's for your own good," he said. His words were coated with concern, but the undertone was steel. "You'll have everything you need. It'll be easier for all of us." I didn't realize then that everything I needed meant control. That my life, my dignity, and my independence were about to be stolen piece by piece. The next day they arrived. Vanessa brought boxes under the guise of helping me pack. Michael smiled politely but kept his distance, like he had rehearsed every moment. They didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't try to convince me, because they didn't need to. I was alone in that house, surrounded by my memories and my quiet defiance. By the time we arrived at the facility, I had already begun to notice the walls. The long corridors, the sterile lighting, the way the staff moved with practiced efficiency. It was like stepping into a cage decorated as a home. The residents were subdued, polite, but there was fear beneath the calm. I could feel it, subtle as a whisper. And I understood immediately that survival here would require more than patience. It would require strategy, cunning, and the ability to endure cruelty without faltering. The first night I lay awake listening. Doors creaked in the hall, voices murmured, footsteps echoed faintly. One of the staff, a young man named Tyler, seemed particularly attentive. Too attentive. I would learn later that he had been sent, quietly, to monitor me, my habits, my movements, my ability to resist. It made sense. Michael had wanted control, and he had ensured I would have no secrets. I spent that night observing. I listened to every creak, every whisper, every breath that passed through the hallways. The fear that had once been mine, the fear of betrayal, of loss, of helplessness, transformed into something else. Awareness, preparation, patience. I realized that in order to survive, I would have to become invisible yet omnipresent, like a shadow haunting the corridors. Days passed, small cruelties became routine. Vanessa questioned my every action at meal times, subtly mocking my habits. "You're slow," she said one morning. "It's okay, Grandma, you're adjusting, we understand." Every word carried a sting, a reminder that I was no longer the person I had been in my own home. Michael rarely spoke to me directly, leaving the intimidation to her and to the carefully selected staff. But I watched. Every glance, every movement, every misplaced object, every whispered conversation. I memorized routines. Tyler checked my door at odd hours. I counted steps, timed patterns, and noticed who watched which corridors. I was learning their weaknesses, their predictable habits, their assumptions that I was fragile and obedient. One night the intruder, Tyler, paused outside my door longer than usual. I pretended to be asleep, breathing softly. I heard the faint click of his shoes, the rustle of his jacket. Then I whispered, not loud, just enough to make him hesitate. "I know you're there," I said softly. There was a pause, then a shuffle. He moved away, cautious. And that small hesitation thrilled me. It was the first sign that fear could work both ways, that even those who believe themselves in control can falter when confronted with someone who refuses to be broken. By the end of the first week, I had begun planting subtle signs of awareness, a tray slightly off-center, a shadow cast in the hall at just the wrong moment, a document left in a visible but unassuming place. Tyler began doubting himself, taking extra care with each step. He assumed I was fragile. I was playing with him. The residents, quietly observing, began to notice my movements. One elderly woman, Helen, whispered to me one evening. "You're not like the rest. You see them, you see how they move, you can use it." I nodded, letting her words sink in. Her confidence, fragile though it was, became a small spark. A reminder that even in this cage, alliances could be made, and even the smallest influence could turn fear into power. By the second week, Michael's plan was showing cracks. Tyler's mistakes increased. The staff whispered more among themselves, their tone shifting from confident control to uneasy suspicion. And I, sitting quietly in my room each night, felt a thrill that was both terrifying and intoxicating. I could strike. Not with violence, not yet, but with precision, with cunning, with the knowledge that every subtle action was unraveling the fragile control my son had worked so hard to establish. I began to plan. My revenge would not be loud, it would not be messy, it would be inevitable. And it would teach them the true cost of betrayal. I remembered every slight, every whispered insult, every attempt to control me. Each memory became a tool, each observation a weapon. I had been underestimated for too long. Now I would show them the power of someone who had endured decades of betrayal and cruelty, and survived. And as I lay awake that night, listening to the faint echoes of the building, I realized something. Survival was only the beginning. The next step was to turn the fear they had inflicted back upon them, to become the ghost in their halls, to make them question every shadow, every sound, every decision. They had thought I was fragile, they had thought I would obey, they had thought they could erase me. They were wrong. The days blended together, each one a test of endurance and observation. I moved through the corridors with quiet precision, watching every staff member, noting every slip, every glance that betrayed their impatience. Tyler, the young man my son had hired to monitor me, had grown cautious, too cautious. His steps faltered where before they had been confident. His eyes darted to corners, his hands shook slightly as he carried trays or paperwork. I let him believe it was me being frail, being careful, pretending. He never suspected the calculation behind my movements. I had memorized every pattern, every routine, every blind spot in the facility. And with each passing day I set subtle traps, psychological snags that made him question every decision. A file left slightly askew. A shadow cast across a hallway at an unexpected angle. The faint sound of a whisper when no one was there. The residents began to notice. Some were still too timid to speak, too afraid to move freely, but others, like Helen, the woman I had befriended quietly, watched with a mix of fear and admiration. She offered small signals, subtle nods that confirmed my observations. Together we began to shift the balance quietly, imperceptibly. One evening I overheard Tyler muttering to himself as he walked down the hall. "I don't understand, I know she's asleep, but..." His voice trailed off. That small crack in his confidence was all I needed to continue. Fear, I realized, was a weapon, and I could wield it more effectively than anyone here ever expected. By the end of the second week, the facility had changed subtly, almost imperceptibly to anyone outside. Small disruptions, minor mistakes, quiet murmurs, each one a thread in a larger tapestry of chaos I had begun to weave. I watched from my room, noting the increase in whispered conversations, the glances of uncertainty from staff, the hesitation in Tyler's movements. They were unraveling, slowly, methodically, and I had not yet moved beyond observation. I had a plan, though it would require patience. Months of enduring cruelty had taught me that timing was everything. One wrong step, one impatient action could ruin everything. But I had learned to be meticulous, to calculate, to let events unfold until the moment was right. Michael called one night. His voice, once warm and familiar, now carried a distant formality, a polite attempt to maintain control. "How are you adjusting, Mom?" he asked. "Adjusting," I repeated softly. "I'm managing just fine." There was a pause. I could almost hear the tension in his breath, the uncertainty creeping in. "You know," he said carefully, "we just want what's best for you." I smiled quietly to myself. And what if what's best for me is not what you decide it is? Silence. I hung up before he could respond. That small moment, that brief exchange, was a reminder of the power I had reclaimed. Even in a place designed to control me, I could bend the rules, manipulate the perceptions, and quietly turn fear into leverage. The next few days were a continuation of this psychological war. Tyler's mistakes became more frequent. He started checking doors twice, leaving paperwork in visible places unnecessarily, second-guessing every instruction. The younger nurses began to notice his odd behavior, whispering about it in corners. I allowed the tension to build, never overtly acting, only letting small clues accumulate. And then there was Vanessa. She thought she could intimidate me through small, calculated comments. "You're slow, Grandma, it's okay, everyone adjusts differently," she said one evening. Her tone was polite but sharp, a knife wrapped in silk. I nodded, smiled faintly, and said nothing. But I noted it. Every word she said, every glance, every small attempt at control was a piece of intelligence I could use. I began leaving tiny, intentional mistakes in my wake. A tray slightly off-center, a blanket draped carelessly, a door left slightly ajar, each a small signal, subtle enough that Tyler would notice and react. Each reaction was recorded in my mind, each hesitation catalogued. I was learning the rhythm of fear in this place, and soon I would use it to orchestrate my next move. The residents started to whisper among themselves more frequently. Helen and I exchanged subtle glances. Small acts of rebellion, moving an object, leaving a note for another resident, began to build a collective sense of quiet power. They were learning slowly that control was not absolute, that fear could be manipulated. And all the while I continued to endure, to observe, to calculate. Michael had tried to erase me from his life, to place me in a controlled environment, to silence me. He had assumed I was fragile, obedient and compliant. He had been wrong. Every night I rehearsed the plan in my mind. How to create undeniable proof of Michael's betrayal, how to expose the staff's errors, how to make Tyler unravel completely without ever touching a hand to him. It would be quiet, precise and devastating. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing to reclaim control, to show that even in the most carefully controlled environment, a woman who had endured decades of betrayal could rise, unseen, unbroken and unstoppable. And as I lay awake in the quiet, listening to the distant footsteps and murmurs of the facility, I realized something. The fear they had tried to instill in me was now their own undoing. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I would comply. And in their arrogance they had left themselves vulnerable to the woman they had sought to erase. The night stretched long and quiet. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the power of observation, patience and meticulous planning settling within me. The world outside these walls could not touch me. Inside these walls I was untouchable. And I knew with absolute certainty that the moment to act would come. Not yet, not tomorrow, but soon, and when it did, the consequences would be irreversible. The following week, the facility's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. Staff and residents alike were on edge, though none realized why. Tyler's usual confidence had eroded. He walked the halls with quickened steps, checking doors twice, muttering to himself about misplaced papers or a tray slightly off-center. Every misstep he made was a silent victory for me, a confirmation that patience and observation could wield power more effectively than force. Vanessa tried to maintain her composure, speaking with practiced politeness, but I could see the frustration simmering beneath her words. She questioned my abilities subtly at meals, implying that I had forgotten details about daily routines or medications. Each comment was meant to belittle, to remind me of my place. But I responded only with a calm nod, a faint smile, or an enigmatic look. I let the weight of silence speak for me. By now the residents were quietly observing as well. Helen, ever the cautious ally, had begun leaving small signals. A misplaced cup here, a faint murmur there, subtle guidance that could be noticed only by someone attuned to detail. Slowly they were learning the rhythm of control, the ebb and flow of fear, hesitation and influence. I began leaving subtle clues in the corridors, a document slightly askew, a shadow cast by a flickering hallway light, a faint sound in a corner that suggested presence. Tyler noticed immediately, pausing to investigate each time. He began second-guessing his every movement, hesitating before entering rooms, adjusting trays unnecessarily, and muttering to himself in frustration. I could almost hear the panic rising in his mind, growing with each small incident. One evening, Vanessa approached me while I was reading a book in the lounge. She offered a soft, condescending smile. "Mom, you're adjusting well, aren't you? Everyone says so." "Yes," I replied evenly. "Adjusting takes time, some of us are faster learners than others." She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I had deliberately spoken in a way that suggested calm confidence while also implying awareness of the control she tried to maintain. Her expression faltered slightly, though she quickly masked it. I spent the next few days observing interactions between staff. Arguments had begun to ripple through the halls, quiet, almost imperceptible disagreements about responsibilities, about schedules, about Tyler's behavior. He was making mistakes, increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention. The residents, whispered warnings and subtle guidance amplified the effect. It became clear fear was contagious, and I was spreading it methodically, deliberately. One night, as I prepared for bed, I overheard Tyler speaking in a low, nervous voice near the nurse's station. "I don't understand, she's just sitting there, but I can feel it. Something's wrong." I smiled quietly. That was exactly what I wanted. The perception that I was fragile was gone. In its place was a sense of omnipresence, a subtle terror born of unpredictability. I began experimenting further. Small, seemingly accidental incidents, an overturned tray, a loose pen, a slightly ajar door, were strategically placed to make Tyler doubt himself and question his environment. His movements became erratic. Vanessa noticed and whispered concerns to Michael during his rare visits. Michael's calls had become infrequent but increasingly cautious. "Mom, are you adjusting? Everyone here tells me you're, well." His voice trailed off, the formal tone betraying unease. "Yes, Michael, I'm adjusting," I said, my voice calm and deliberate. "Better than anyone expected, it seems." He didn't respond immediately. Silence, then the faintest sigh. That pause told me he was beginning to realize that control had shifted subtly, irrevocably, and he couldn't intervene directly from miles away. Meanwhile, I continued my meticulous mapping of the facility. I noted every security camera, every routine check, every hallway where staff hesitated. I catalogued Tyler's patterns, his nervous tics, the way he avoided certain corners, the times he glanced toward rooms he shouldn't have. Each observation added to a blueprint, a mental map of vulnerabilities and opportunities. The residents began to participate more actively, albeit in small, covert ways. One resident would leave a cup slightly out of place. Another would comment softly about a misplaced item, knowing I would hear it and Tyler would notice it. Little by little, the entire home became an instrument of calculated chaos, without anyone realizing the conductor was sitting quietly in the lounge, reading, and watching every move. By the third week, the facility's atmosphere had transformed. Staff were tense, hesitant, and prone to mistakes. Tyler's self-doubt was palpable, his confident facade shattered. Vanessa's attempts at control were increasingly transparent, failing to mask her growing unease. And Michael's distant calls carried a note of anxiety I hadn't heard before. I realized then that the first phase of my plan, observation, endurance, subtle manipulation, was complete. They had underestimated me completely. They had assumed I was compliant, frail, and obedient. They were wrong. The next phase would require careful precision. Exposing Tyler, demonstrating his failures, amplifying fear among the staff, and eventually forcing Michael to face the consequences of his betrayal. I spent long hours each night rehearsing, planning, anticipating. The whispers of the hallways, the shifting shadows, the quiet murmurings of the residents, all were signals, small markers that guided the timing and execution of my plan. I was learning the language of fear and power, and I intended to speak it fluently. And in the quiet of my room, I acknowledged the truth I had discovered over these weeks. The world could attempt to break you, to erase you, to silence you, but it could never touch the mind of someone who had endured betrayal, survived cruelty, and emerged cunning, calculating, and unbroken. The night stretched on, long and deliberate. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the current of power and awareness settle within me. The moment to act was approaching. Soon, every misstep, every hesitation, every carefully orchestrated accident would converge. And when it did, those who had tried to erase me would discover that survival, patience, and cunning can become instruments of unstoppable, silent revenge. By the fourth week, the facility had subtly but unmistakably shifted. Every hallway, every corner, every glance carried a tension I had cultivated with meticulous care. Tyler, the young man who had been sent to monitor me, was unraveling. His steps were hesitant, his eyes flicked constantly to shadows, and every small incident caused him to pause mid-action. I began to increase the pressure. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to push him further toward self-doubt. I left small accidents in the hallways, a slightly open door, a tray that seemed to tip of its own accord, a faint noise in the distance that couldn't be located. Tyler reacted every time, muttering under his breath, jittery and unsure. I watched quietly from my room, taking note of every micro-expression, every misstep, every sign of growing panic. Vanessa, ever the orchestrator of subtle intimidation, was losing her grip as well. She approached me one morning with a forced smile, her tone dripping with faux concern. "Mom, maybe you should rest today," she said, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting resistance. I looked at her calmly. "Resting sounds lovely, but I have things to attend to." She blinked, momentarily thrown off by the calmness in my voice. I didn't need to speak further. The message had been delivered. I was aware, present, and far from powerless. The residents were starting to play a larger role. Helen and a few others who had quietly aligned with me began small acts that amplified the chaos I was orchestrating. A misplaced object here, a soft warning there, a faint noise in a corridor. Together, we turned the building into a maze of uncertainty, where staff and Tyler constantly questioned their own perceptions. One evening, Tyler came into the lounge, attempting to appear casual. I thought I saw something, maybe it was nothing," he stammered. I didn't react. My calm, unblinking gaze made him pause, the weight of his nervousness apparent in his every movement. He backed away slowly, muttering something about checking other rooms. This was exactly the response I wanted. Fear had become my ally, subtle but powerful. Tyler was now a puppet to my observations and careful manipulations, and the staff were beginning to feel the ripple effects. Mistakes were increasing, tension was mounting, and even Vanessa seemed less certain of her control. Michael's calls had become more cautious. "Mom, everything okay? The staff, the residents." His voice was polite, formal, but now laced with something I hadn't heard before, doubt. "Yes, Michael," I replied evenly. "Everything is as it should be." He hesitated. That pause, that slight crack in his voice, confirmed that the first layers of my plan had worked. He was beginning to feel the consequences of underestimating me. I spent the next few nights reinforcing the psychological tension. I orchestrated small, seemingly accidental events, a faint whisper when no one was present, a tray slightly tilted, a door left ajar at just the right angle. Tyler's unease grew with every incident. The staff began to argue quietly among themselves, questioning each other, questioning the decisions they had made, and questioning their ability to manage the environment. The residents watched with quiet fascination. They whispered among themselves, aligning their small actions with mine, and the ripple effects intensified. The building, once a place of strict control, was now subtly but completely under my influence. Vanessa's attempts to maintain her authority were faltering. She questioned staff more often, demanded explanations that made no sense, and her face betrayed frustration she could not mask. Tyler was visibly on edge, glancing at corners, hesitating before approaching rooms, and muttering apologies that were unnecessary. The plan was working. Each calculated move, each observation, each patient manipulation had culminated in a precise shift of power. Michael could not see it directly, but he sensed it through the increasingly frequent calls, through the nervous tone of Vanessa, and through the reports that made their way back to him. I knew the time for the next phase was approaching. The moment to expose Tyler fully, to amplify the fear within the staff, and to force Michael to confront the consequences of his betrayal was near. I rehearsed the steps quietly, visualizing each action, anticipating every reaction. Every whisper in the hall, every flicker of shadow, every small act by the residents was a note in the symphony of my plan. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the distant echoes of the facility, I realized a truth I had discovered long ago but now wielded with precision. Cruelty and fear can be returned with interest. The same tools that had been used against me were now instruments I could control. The young man who had been sent to monitor me would soon become the instrument of his own unraveling. The staff, who had underestimated my awareness, would falter under the weight of tension I had introduced. And Michael would soon understand, finally, that a woman who has endured betrayal, who has survived cruelty, and who has cultivated patience and cunning, can rise unbroken and unstoppable. The night grew longer, the building quieter, and yet tension vibrated in the air. I smiled faintly, feeling the subtle power of observation, patience, and anticipation. The moment to act would arrive, and when it did, the consequences would be precise, devastating, and irreversible. And in the quiet of that night, I understood fully. Those who believe they control others are always vulnerable to someone who has nothing left to lose but their patience, and everything to gain by turning fear into a weapon. The first deliberate move came on a quiet Thursday morning. The hallways were empty, the residents still in their rooms, and the staff moving with their usual efficiency, unaware that every action they took was now being observed and calculated. Tyler entered the corridor, his shoulders tense, his steps hesitant, as if he could feel the invisible presence tracking him. I waited in the lounge, seated with my knitting, but my eyes never left him. I allowed him to see me only from the corner of his vision, enough to remind him that I was aware. He flinched subtly with each glance, a reaction that made my pulse quicken, not with excitement but with the cold satisfaction of precision. Vanessa passed by, smiling as though nothing was amiss. But the faint twitch in her jaw betrayed irritation, a subtle acknowledgement that she sensed the shift but could not understand its origin. I let her believe the tension came from me merely adjusting to the environment. In truth, it came from years of planning, years of observation, and now the accumulation of small, deliberate manipulations. I had begun placing small objects strategically. A misplaced pen here, a slightly tilted tray there, a door left ajar to suggest a shadowy presence. Tyler reacted every single time, sometimes speaking softly to himself, other times whispering excuses to the staff. His panic grew, but he still tried to appear in control, his facade slowly crumbling. The residents who had been quietly aligning with me became more confident. Helen and a few others would perform minor acts that further destabilized the staff. A door slightly open, a forgotten towel, a soft warning whispered down the hall. Each small gesture reinforced the environment of uncertainty I was cultivating. One evening, Tyler approached me while I was sitting in the lounge. His voice was low, uncertain. I thought I saw something in the corridor, maybe it was nothing. I looked up calmly, letting the weight of my gaze settle on him. Maybe, I said softly, or maybe not. He backed away slowly, muttering under his breath. That was the exact response I had anticipated. Fear was now my tool, subtle but powerful, and he was beginning to wield it against himself. Over the next few days, I increased the psychological pressure. I let small incidents accumulate, a tray slightly off-center, a pen falling from a clipboard, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. Each action caused Tyler to hesitate, each hesitation caused him to question his own judgment, and each mistake amplified the tension among the staff. Vanessa's composure began to crack. She questioned Tyler more frequently, her polite smile replaced with subtle impatience. The staff whispered among themselves, noticing the increasing errors, trying to determine the source of the disruption. Michael's rare calls reflected growing unease. "Mom, are you okay? Everyone says things are fine, but..." His voice faltered, betraying the anxiety he had been hiding behind formal pleasantries. "Yes, Michael," I said evenly, "everything is as it should be." The pause that followed was satisfying. He could sense something shifting, but he could not see it directly. He was beginning to feel the consequences of underestimating me. The residents grew bolder in their quiet participation. Each day, small acts of rebellion combined with the psychological pressure I applied to the staff. Tyler's panic escalated. Vanessa's control waned. The subtle chaos I had orchestrated reached its tipping point. I spent long hours planning my next moves. The goal was clear: expose Tyler fully, amplify fear among the staff, and make Michael confront the consequences of his betrayal. Patience remained my greatest weapon. Every misstep, every hesitation, every subtle act would accumulate until the moment of truth arrived. I understood fully the lessons that years of betrayal had taught me. Patience, observation, and the quiet application of fear could achieve what force never could. Those who believed they controlled others were blind to the precision of a mind that had survived decades of cruelty. And as night fell, I felt the weight of anticipation settling around me. The phase of preparation was ending, and the phase of action was approaching. Those who had tried to erase me, to control me, to belittle me, were about to discover that survival was only the beginning, and that the consequences of underestimating me would be irreversible. The facility had grown tense in a way that was almost imperceptible to outsiders, but I could feel it in every corner, in every whisper, in every glance. Tyler's confidence had eroded entirely. He moved down the hallways like a man unsure of his own shadow, constantly checking doors, adjusting trays unnecessarily, and muttering under his breath. Vanessa's polite exterior was cracking. Her eyes betrayed worry she tried to mask with rehearsed smiles. Michael, miles away, could sense the unease creeping into their voices during phone calls, though he had no way of seeing what was happening in real time. I spent hours each day observing, cataloguing, and strategizing. Every corridor became a map of opportunity. Every staff routine was a sequence I could predict and manipulate. I had begun introducing subtle inconsistencies that, while seeming accidental, were designed to destabilize the system. A misplaced clipboard here, a faint sound in an empty hallway there, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. Tyler reacted every single time, and the staff's nerves frayed further as they struggled to understand the source of the disruptions. The residents, once fearful and silent, began participating quietly. Helen and a few others performed minor acts that amplified the subtle chaos. A cup left slightly out of place, a blanket draped awkwardly, a gentle warning whispered down the hall. These small gestures created a ripple effect, magnifying the tension I had initiated. Tyler's unraveling was nearly complete. One afternoon, he walked into the lounge while I was reading, attempting to appear calm. His voice trembled slightly. "I thought I saw someone or something, I don't know." I looked up from my book, meeting his gaze with a quiet intensity. "Maybe," I said softly, "or maybe not." His shoulders tensed and he retreated quickly. Fear was now my ally, subtle and precise, and he was beginning to wield it against himself. Vanessa's frustration was growing as well. She began questioning staff more frequently, demanding explanations that only highlighted mistakes. The staff whispered among themselves, unsure of who was causing the disturbances. Their confidence crumbled, and the delicate balance of control shifted subtly but unmistakably toward me. Michael's calls reflected growing anxiety. "Mom, are you sure you're okay? Everyone says, well, things seem off." His tone was polite but uneasy. "Yes, Michael, everything is as it should be," I replied evenly, letting the weight of my calmness contrast with the tension he sensed. Meanwhile, I began preparing the residents for more active participation. Helen had become my quiet ally, learning the rhythm of manipulation and subtle disruption. Together, we orchestrated small events that seemed accidental to the untrained eye: objects slightly displaced, sounds in the hall that suggested presence, faint whispers in corners. Each act caused Tyler and the staff to second-guess themselves, creating a pervasive sense of unease throughout the facility. I had also begun documenting everything carefully. Notes, small sketches, timings, sequences of errors, all recorded with precision. This archive would serve as undeniable proof when the moment to confront Michael arrived. Every act of negligence, every attempt at intimidation, every subtle betrayal would be undeniable. The psychological pressure on Tyler reached a peak one evening. He entered the lounge to deliver an afternoon snack, and I allowed a tray to tilt slightly as he passed. He froze, eyes widening, muttering apologies under his breath as he adjusted it. His every movement betrayed the growing panic. Vanessa's eyes flickered toward me, realizing that my calm presence was the catalyst for Tyler's erratic behavior. I smiled faintly to myself. The system they had designed to control me was now unraveling under the weight of their own fear. I had become the invisible force orchestrating the chaos, a presence that no one could directly confront or counter. Residents began coordinating more openly. They moved objects intentionally, whispered soft warnings, and subtly guided staff toward mistakes. The ripple effect magnified, and the facility became a landscape of tension, uncertainty, and subtle terror. Michael called again, his voice edged with concern. "Mom, the staff, they sound tense. Are you causing trouble?" I replied softly, deliberately. "I'm simply observing, Michael. Things are exactly as they should be." Silence followed. I knew he sensed that control was slipping from his grasp, that his attempts to dominate my life were failing spectacularly. I spent the nights planning the next phase: the exposure of Tyler, the amplification of fear among staff, and the subtle psychological confrontation with Michael. I imagined every scenario, every potential reaction, and every outcome. The timing had to be perfect. One misstep, one premature action, could ruin the precision I had built over weeks. The residents had become active participants in this orchestration, their quiet alignment with me turning the facility into a carefully managed system of tension and observation. Every small act, seemingly accidental, contributed to the larger plan. I reflected on the lessons that years of betrayal and hardship had taught me. Patience, observation, and the precise application of psychological pressure could achieve what direct confrontation never could. Those who believed themselves in control were blind to the power of a mind honed by decades of survival, endurance, and strategic thinking. As the week drew to a close, I felt the shift solidifying. Tyler's panic was near total. Vanessa's attempts at authority were increasingly transparent. The staff were constantly questioning their own actions. And Michael would soon realize the consequences of underestimating me, though he still could not see the full scope of the plan. I closed my eyes that night, feeling the culmination of weeks of meticulous preparation settle within me. The moment of action was approaching. Soon every misstep, every hesitation, every carefully orchestrated incident would converge. And when it did, those who had tried to erase me, control me, and belittle me would discover that survival is not just endurance. It is strategy, patience, and the quiet, devastating power of a mind that refuses to be broken. The night stretched on, quiet but electric with anticipation. I smiled faintly, aware that the invisible tension I had cultivated throughout the facility was nearing its peak. The time for the first direct moves against Tyler and the staff had come, and the ripple effects would extend far beyond what anyone anticipated. Every shadow, every whisper, every movement had been accounted for. The residents, the staff, and even Michael, unknowingly, were all pieces in a carefully orchestrated pattern. And I, long underestimated and silenced, was the invisible hand guiding the outcome. In that quiet, I acknowledged the truth that had become my weapon. Patience, cunning, and a mind forged in decades of betrayal could outmatch any force, any attempt at control, and any underestimation. Those who believed they could erase me were about to learn the cost of their arrogance. The morning was quiet, but the air was thick with tension. I could feel it in every corner of the facility, every creak of the floorboards, every cautious glance from the staff. Tyler had reached the point where even his shadow betrayed him. His steps faltered, his hands shook as he carried trays, and the smallest irregularity sent him into a spiral of self-doubt. Vanessa's eyes darted nervously, scanning corridors as if searching for the invisible force that had undone her authority. Michael's call came that afternoon. His tone was careful, polite, but it carried a tremor of unease I had never heard before. "Mom, everything okay? The staff, I mean, are they?" "Yes, Michael," I interrupted softly. "Everything is as it should be." Silence followed. He could sense the shift, but he had no idea of the full extent of what I had orchestrated. That was precisely how it should be. I had spent months quietly observing, cataloguing, and planning. Every corridor, every routine, every staff habit had been noted. Every mistake Tyler had made, every subtle act of intimidation from Vanessa, every attempt by Michael to control me from afar had become part of the blueprint for my silent, devastating response. The residents had played their part too. Helen and the others had executed small acts of subtle chaos perfectly. Misplaced cups, whispered warnings, minor disturbances that amplified Tyler's paranoia and unsettled Vanessa. They were no longer victims, but allies in the quiet, unbroken war of survival I had waged. By late afternoon, I enacted the first phase of the final move. Tyler entered the lounge to deliver paperwork. I allowed a pen to roll off the table, stopping inches from his foot. His eyes widened, his jaw tightened, and he muttered an apology without understanding that this was the culmination of weeks of careful manipulation. Every misstep, every hesitation, every small panic he had experienced had led to this moment. Vanessa approached, attempting to assert control, but her words faltered as she saw Tyler's nervous demeanor. The staff exchanged anxious glances, realizing that something in the facility had shifted beyond their comprehension. They were puppets in a game they could not see, and I was the unseen hand guiding each move. I spoke softly, clearly, and deliberately. It seems some of us need reminders of how fragile confidence can be. Tyler flinched, Vanessa froze, and the staff collectively tensed. I let the silence stretch, long enough for the weight of observation and fear to settle into their bones. Every subtle incident, every whispered warning, every shadowy movement I had orchestrated culminated in this charged moment. That evening, Michael arrived. His polite tone carried a thin layer of fear he could not disguise. He had come to assess the situation himself, to regain some semblance of control over the woman he had underestimated for decades. I met him in the lounge, calm, composed, unbroken. "Mom," he began, "I didn't expect, the staff." "They underestimated me," I interrupted, my voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "They underestimated my awareness, my patience, and my resilience. You, Michael, thought you could erase me, control me, silence me. You were wrong." He swallowed, silent. Vanessa and Tyler watched, frozen, as I continued. "I have endured betrayal, cruelty, and humiliation. I have survived attempts to diminish me, attempts to manipulate me, and attempts to erase my presence. And now, the consequences of those attempts are yours to witness." I gestured to the facility around us. Staff were visibly anxious, their errors amplified by weeks of psychological tension I had orchestrated. Tyler's confidence was shattered entirely. Vanessa's carefully maintained composure was broken. And Michael, for the first time, truly understood the extent of his failure. "You wanted control," I said softly. "You wanted to dictate my life, to decide my worth. But control is an illusion when faced with endurance, cunning, and unbroken resolve. I am here, I have survived. And you," my gaze swept over Michael, Vanessa, and Tyler, "have learned too late the cost of underestimating a woman who refuses to be broken." The staff looked at me, some with awe, some with fear, as the residents quietly observed from their rooms and hallways. Helen approached, her eyes shining. "You've taught us," she whispered, "that even when broken we can rise." I nodded. Silence settled over the room, heavy and deliberate. It was the silence of power regained, of control reclaimed, of justice delivered not through violence, but through patience, observation, and cunning. Michael left that night quietly, defeated not by words or force, but by the undeniable presence of a woman he had underestimated, a woman who had survived the unthinkable and emerged unbroken. Vanessa and Tyler remained, shadows of their former confidence, aware that they could no longer dominate, manipulate, or intimidate. I returned to my room, sitting by the window, watching the fading light filter through the curtains. The house, once a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. Every corner, every shadow, every whisper was familiar, observed, and under my control. I thought of the years I had endured, every betrayal, every cruel word, every calculated attempt to diminish me. Each one had led me to this moment. I had survived, I had endured, I had risen. And as the night settled around the facility, I whispered to myself, "They thought they could erase me, they thought they could break me, they were wrong, I am unbroken, I am untouchable, and I will remain so." The facility was quiet now, the tension dissolved into respect, fear, and understanding. The residents were no longer victims but witnesses to endurance and cunning. And I was the invisible force that had reclaimed control, delivered justice, and demonstrated that survival, patience, and intelligence can triumph over cruelty and betrayal. In the quiet of that night, I realized the truth I had known all along. A woman who refuses to be broken cannot be controlled, silenced, or erased. She survives, she endures, and she rises always.